Alright, this is civil rights number 4. This is the start of something big. When we last left, we saw where Eisenhower sent down federal troops to make the states comply with the Brown decision. And the African American community is absolutely happy behind this. They think Eisenhower is going to be the one to make this Civil Rights Act and end de jure segregation, and they are wrong. Civil Rights Act 57, as I said, was not the all-encompassing one they wanted. It simply said, listen to the law, guys, and go from there, okay? Now, in 1958, Birmingham takes on the nickname of Bommingham, all right? And it was Bommingham because a lot of these white citizen councils and night riders and Klan members are going to bomb churches, they're going to bomb meeting houses, things like that. So we kind of shift from Montgomery, which is seen as kind of a very integrated place, to Birmingham. And we're going to really focus in from 1958 until about 1963 in Birmingham and try to change that culture. Okay? Now, also in the South, there existed another, maybe not anti-civil rights at the start, but it will be used. That it is still around today. It's called John Birch Society. Now, the John Birch Society mainly is a anti-communist group. Remember, the 1950s was all about communism, McCarthyism, right? So what they are going to try to say is that Dr. King, and you can maybe see it in the background there, is in fact a communist. And they're going to put those two things together. And so they're now going to hate Dr. King, not necessarily for being an integrationist, but also for being a communist and things like that. And this is actually going to attract the attention of the FBI once they make these claims. So the FBI begins to start keeping tabs on Dr. King and where he is. And in fact, they had a very well-known informant keeping them abreast or aware of what he was doing. And in the last video in the 80s, when it becomes commonplace, I will tell you who that informant is. And it may surprise you because he's a very popular man. All right? Now, we have group number 4 of the Big Six. The SCLC had a director named Ella Baker. And Ella Baker said, excuse me, we're not using to our full potential the people we could. We're not using the students, the youthful energy. So on the campus of Shaw University, North Carolina, they are going to start the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or simply put, SNCC. And so they are Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, they're et cetera. So we have, let's go back through this real quick, NAACP with the courts and Constitution. We have CORE using these protests, SCLC, Dr. King's going to be known about as marches, okay, that's what he is. And SNCC needs their own method. And they're going to be known for a very kind of radical way of doing things, and I'm going to explain what that is. Now, again, notice white and black integrational colors, as well as a big slogan of "We shall overcome." Now, their movement, their favorite method of protest was called a sit-in. And so a sit-in is exactly as it sounds. You would go into one of these places that was segregated, and you would simply sit down. Now, why is this such a big deal? Because if you're doing this nonviolent and you're not really going through much else, the only way to respond to this is with force, and people are going to see how bad this looks. The first sit-in was at a department store called Woolworth's in Greensboro, North Carolina, and from there it spreads on, etc. And in class, we're actually going to simulate a sit-in per se, not 100% because I'm not going to do that, but using the sit-in National Museum, I'm going to kind of put you through a mock sit-in, if you will, and see how you would respond in a certain situation. So, 1960, we have a second Civil Rights Act. There's 4, actually. So, 57 did nothing more but just prevent, another Little Rock now from occurring. The Civil Rights Act of 1960 allowed the government to inspect polling places, and it became a crime to obstruct anyone in the federal registration process. However, this is also the longest filibuster in U.S. history. Uh, a filibuster is where you try to talk a bill to death, and Strom Thurmond talked for, I believe it was close to 26 hours or something ridiculous like that, uh, to get this to die. Eventually, he had to sit down. They did pass it. Again, it's not the all-encompassing one. It's not going to end separate but equal. That's what they want, okay? Now, around the 1960s as well, we see the formation of a new religion. And this religion became a major player in militant means by force, as well as black nationalism. It was started by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and it is called the Nation of Islam. Now, the Nation of Islam has many beliefs. Many of those beliefs go hand in hand with the actual religion of Islam that we know. So what sets the Nation of Islam apart from actual Islam? Two things really come of note. Number one, when you joined the Nation of Islam, you were to drop what was called your slave name, aka your last name, and take on a different name. For example, Cassius Clay becomes Muhammad Ali. Lou Alcindor becomes Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Okay, uh, that's what I'm meaning. Okay. The second thing is they actually are going to start promoting black rifle clubs and things like that, using militant means to get their point across. They are actually separatist, and in a very, very weird way actually agree with the KKK. We don't want to be part of a normal society. You have yours, and we'll have ours. We'll just simply kind of coexist. Okay? The big mouthpiece, the big focal person, Dr. King was the big one for the nonviolent movement. For the militant movement, it is Malcolm X. He was born Malcolm Little. Of course, he has to drop that name. He becomes known as Malcolm X. Now, the Nation of Islam is still around today. You might see them out dressed like this. And in fact, probably one of the bigger, well-known members of the Nation of Islam is Dave Chappelle. But there are many, many members of the Nation of Islam. And so, let's keep going. Now, in 1961, President Kennedy will sign Executive Order 10925, and this is called the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, but we call it affirmative action. So, affirmative action, again, if you remember, we talked about it, is to basically give a preferential or a preference in the hiring process due to past injustices. Okay? The whole goal of this was to set up a commission to make sure that everyone had the same opportunities in hiring, and you weren't just simply discriminating on someone because of their race or gender or anything else. Okay? This doesn't really kind of put affirmative action in motion. That will happen later on, but it's the first time we hear the term affirmative action, which is a big topic of debate today. Now, in 1961, CORE probably does their most well-known thing. They said, okay, here's what we're going to do. Montgomery integrated their buses. So we want to put whites and blacks on a bus in the north, drive it into the south, and see what happens. Okay? These are called the Freedom Rides, or Freedom Riders. There's actually a really good documentary on PBS. I cannot show it to you due to the language. It was kind of set in the time, but if you ever have time, pull it up on PBS on the internet and check it out. It's really, really interesting. But back to this. They're going to drive it down into the south, and the Freedom Ride is really focused on the state of Alabama. They pull up into Birmingham, and everyone on the bus is beaten. They pull into Montgomery. Again, they are beaten. And I'm not talking a little beating. I'm talking people sent to hospital, being hit with baseball bats, being knocked unconscious. Whites, blacks, didn't matter. If you were on the bus and you got off, you were beaten by the citizen councils. While the police, in some cases, are actually there watching this. But the biggest and probably the most visual anesthetic of not just the freedom rides, but also this becomes one of the biggest pictures of the whole civil rights movement in the 60s, was in Anniston, Alabama. The Klan actually physically blocked the bus,
and threw a firebomb on, with the whole purpose of killing everybody inside. Uh, they got the Klan to go away. The people got off the bus in a very uh, quick manner. Nobody was seriously injured. There was some smoke inhalation, etc. But the bus burned down. Now, the next day, what happened? They sent them another bus, and they kept going on the freedom rides. Um, Again, every time they stop and someone's being beaten, there's a newspaper there documenting this, and that newspaper is getting into the hands of lots of people wanting to promote change. Okay? So that's why it's very, very important. Now, 1962, we have our fifth of the Big Six, and this is called COFO. COFO is the Council of Federated Organizations, and it's basically a blend of all the other things we talked about. It's a blend of the NAACP, it's a blend of CORE, it's a blend of SDLC, of SNCC, and local groups. Their main goal is to get people registered to vote. That's all they want to do. So they want to go and set up voter education projects and things like that. Now, the sixth member of the Big Six, of course, is the National Urban League, which I left out here. They're worried about housing. So those are our big six groups of these protests. Everyone had their own little unique aspects. Now, also in 1962, we have, as the book is called here, A Mission from God. James Meredith is going to attempt to enter the University of Mississippi, a.k.a. Ole Miss. Ole Miss had been set up, and not just Ole Miss, but Mississippi State and Southern Miss. These big institutions were only white institutions. So the separate African American colleges had been established in places like Alcorn State and Jackson State, Rust, Lemoyne on. These places existed for the African Americans to go. However, the educational value was diminished. So James Meredith is going to go and enter Ole Miss. Okay? That's the whole goal. The governor of Ole Miss, a man named Ross Barnett, seen here, at a football game, nonetheless, becomes aware that Meredith has tried to enter. And so he riles up the crowd and kind of incites a riot to go back to Ole Miss and prevent him from getting in the school. So in 1962, at the place where there's now a statue of James Meredith entering the Lyceum, which is where admissions were at the time, they broke into the chem lab and they had chemicals and they're rioting and all these things are going crazy. The marshals are actually called down from the Department of Justice by order of Robert Kennedy, who became aware of this. There's a marshal actually killed. There's a civilian killed. And so through some telephone conversations, and we'll actually look at some of these in class, and they're very, very interesting and cool, Kennedy and Barnett basically come to a conclusion, and that is Kennedy is trying to go by the Brown decision and integrate the school. Barnett is trying to go by the laws of the states, aka states' rights, and prevent him. So how is it ultimately resolved? Kennedy does what his predecessor, or the previous president, did. He sends down the army, he puts the city of Oxford, Mississippi under martial law, and he gets Ole Miss integrated. James Meredith goes to school, and in fact, he has a very high presence today. And generally, if you look up into the stands at every Ole Miss game, if they have an ESPN or anything like this, you'll see a man in a white suit. That's James Meredith. He's written many books. He's done some professor work there in Southern culture, but he's a pretty predominant figure on campus. Okay. Now, it was not just Ole Miss. A lot of people go, oh, Ole Miss and this, that, and the other. I attended Ole Miss. I had many African American friends at Ole Miss, and it's not what it's making out to be. And that's kind of maybe the namesake and things like that. Because in 1963, the University of Alabama does the same thing. Governor George Wallace stood in front of the Tuscaloosa campus of University of Alabama and gave a speech in which he said, segregation now, segregation forever, and stood in the doorway blocking two African American students. Now, this scene has been used in many movies, most notably in Forrest Gump when he walks behind her fictionally and goes, "Miss, you dropped your book. You dropped your book." So, what we have now, Arkansas is not listening, Mississippi is not listening, Alabama is not listening, and there's other states, South Carolina, and so the South really will not do anything unless there is an all-encompassing Civil Rights Act to say separate but equal is not constitutional. You cannot do it under any circumstance. And we're getting close here, all right? So that is it for the fourth video now. The fifth video goes 64 and really moving into some other things we need to get into.